Norman Solomon has pointed out that journalists aren't supposed to what they call bury the lead. It's something I had to learn when I worked at CNN. The most important part of the story should be right at the top in order to make it very clear what the article is going to be about. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of reading an important piece of journalism, and it usually comes in print medium, not electronic, but you're reading an important piece of journalism, and all of a sudden you get to the fifth paragraph or the sixth paragraph, and you discover what is the most important thing about the article. And it's like, wow, why isn't this at the top? All right, that's called burying the lead. So journalists aren't supposed to do that. But when death is the topic and corporate power is the culprit, the connection between death and corporate power largely goes unmentioned. And there's a reason for that. Most newspapers, not all, but most newspapers are part of a vertical corporate structure. Most newspapers are not owned by publishers, individual publishers, or publishing families who have been in the publishing business for, 50, 100, 200 years since they established a newspaper. A lot of newspapers are being bought by hedge fund operators. Their pieces sold off, and they turn it into an online publication, which is bullshit in terms of real journalism, but I digress. A lot of the articles I pick up come from online, but they usually are backed up by print journalism. Norman Solomon is a little bit different. He writes a lot online, but I'm not going to hold that against him. Me. But he's talking about class war. And he makes the obvious statement that class war is usually, or often, or always waged methodically from the top down. We peasants, the proles down here at the bottom of the ladder, we usually don't wage war up against corporate power, do we? But class war is so constant and pervasive, Solomon points out, that it might seem unremarkable. The endless siege to make large companies more profitable and the wealthy more wealthy is going on all around us. That's what all business in the United States is about. Beyond the small independent business owner. I'm not talking about a shop owner, a man or woman that has independently owned business. I'm not talking about that. But in that process of the wealthy getting more wealthy and large companies more profitable, that process normalizes avoidable death as just a cost of doing business. Well, so the oil company blew up down in Houston. How many people? 17 people killed? Well, hearts and prayers, hearts and prayers, hearts and prayers. Now, overall news media are part of that normalization. They are, whether we like it or not. We all have our favorite news outlets and our favorite anchor people and our favorite writers. I certainly do. But as Solomon points out, while negative coverage of Donald Trump has been common due to his handling of this pandemic, media outrage has pretty much been muted in relation to the magnitude of the dying in our midst at a time when most of the dying could have been prevented. Solomon points out that deaths tend to become less newsworthy, quote, quote, as the numbers mount. Who was it? Was it Stalin that said one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic? Somebody said that. Anyway, on that basis, death becomes less newsworthy as the numbers mount. And shock of this death gives way to tacit media acceptance. Okay. Now, true, most of the online the cable networks, they have the death count and the sickness count in the United States and globally up on their screens during the day. But as Solomon points out, a new lethal reality is built on dominant structures that keep serving the financial priorities of the powerful. And you know this to be true, Truth Seeker, this next sentence, because you have witnessed it. Solomon writes, emphasis is often less about saving lives and more about saving the stock market. The storyline becomes more about opening a state, opening an economy, and less about dying, even though opening has caused and is sure to cause more dying. But the problem here in the United States, because we live in a predatory capitalist system, and it matters not to me whether you agree with that statement or not, but I truly, not to be a smartass here, but I truly don't care. That's where we live. And the patterns of economic injustice as a result of predatory capitalism are so basic in U.S. society that they amount to deep cracks in the foundation of this country. Solomon writes, under the weight of catastrophe, whether hurricane or recession or pandemic, the cracks split wider and wider as more human beings, disproportionately poor and people of color, fall into the abyss. Corporate media narratives routinely bypass these core truths about cause and effect. Heartbreaking stories have very little context. They are victims, the ones that we do read about. You know, the frontline worker or this person or that person and the tragedy of that person's death. But they're victims without victimizers. Fueled by ultra greed, Norman writes, Trump's approach is a kind of scorched earth, nonstop campaign, an extreme version of the asymmetrical class warfare going on all the time. Asymmetrical, of course, because you and I don't have it. We can't fight against this kind of class warfare. What are we going to do? Go up to Jeff Bezos and say, hey, wait a minute, goddamn. The progressive publisher OR Books noted in an email to supporters this week, quote, the world before COVID-19 was a deeply unequal place. Now, in the pandemic, those inequalities are only more stark. Across America and around the globe are fabulous riches for a tiny few and deepening immiseration for everybody else. End quote. David Geffen, if you'll remember back in late March, sent a very quickly infamous Instagram post. David Geffen's net worth is around $8.7 billion. But in the Instagram post, he showed his $500 million yacht at sunset as the pandemic took deadly hold in the United States. And the post, the words that went with it were these: isolated in the Grenadines, avoiding the virus. I hope everybody is staying safe. Geffen is no right-winger. He's a liberal. In the 2018 election cycle, he gave $1 million to Democratic congressional super PACs. And he went on to become a donor to Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign. But As Norman Solomon points out, the most pernicious and ultimately destructive actions of the super wealthy are not so overtly gauche as his Instagram photo of his $500 million yacht. The poisons that the ultra-rich pump into us and onto us are laced with soothing PR, while the rich movers and shakers play by the rules that capitalism has constructed for the voracious acquisition of wealth at the expense of everyone else. So in that sense, the worst class war crimes are the ones that adhere to the rules and therefore don't get singled out for condemnation. Oh my goodness, we hear about the wealthy people who, before they became politicians, maybe they owned a health insurance company where they took premiums, and when it came time to answer claims or pay off claims, oh, well, you had a pre-existing condition. Oh, well, you didn't tell us that when you were 10 years old you broke your ankle, so how in the hell do you expect us now when you're 80 to pay for your spine surgery? Now, we might we might hear about that because it's so egregious. But we don't hear about the class warfare crimes that go on constantly. Even down to this point. So here we are, a few months into 2020, and capitalism is running amok in tandem with the coronavirus like some headless horseman galloping over dead bodies. And meanwhile, and you know this to be true for U.S. news media accustomed to covering faraway disasters, a reflex has set in close to home, turning the page on death, increasingly presenting deaths as numbers. So what is the outcome of this? And I don't like what Norman Solomon accuses me of, all of us. He says, an anesthetized pall of acceptance is descending on us. Now, I don't like it, but he's right. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. You have your choice. You can listen to the ranting with the audio podcast or listen and watch me lose control with a video podcast subscription. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.